Now, real quick, I want to go back to this Rand Corporation paper, providing lethal aid to Ukraine. Under which administration did that begin? It began under the Trump administration. And it wasn't because President Obama refused to do it. It simply wasn't time yet to do it. This was a step-by-step process. Providing lethal aid was inevitable. It didn't matter who was in the White House. When it was time to do it, it would be done. It just so happened that President Trump was in office. And so here's from ABC News. This was 2019. Trump admin approves new sale of anti-tank weapons to Ukraine. And this is following previous approval in 2017. Trump administration has approved the $39 million sale of defensive lethal weapons to Ukraine. So lethal aid right there. The new package will include Javelin anti-tank weapons, with one U.S. official saying it includes 150 missiles and 2 launchers. This followed a $400 million military assistance package for maritime security, special operations units, secure communications, and light weapons like sniper rifles and rocket-propelled grenade launchers. And it points out that the Trump administration first approved the sale of Javelins to Ukraine in December 2017, a step that former President Barack Obama never took and that Trump allies have pointed to as a sign of Trump's toughness on Russia. And again, this is the WWE professional wrestling style narratives that U.S. politics uses to convince American people that there is some sort of debate taking place, and that this is not just simply continuity of agenda, but I assure you, it is continuity of agenda. If it was Hillary Clinton in office instead of former President Donald Trump, then she would have done this also at this time. This was the time to do it. They were trying to provoke Russia into being drawn into Ukraine and overextending itself. That was what this was all about. Now, former President Trump sending actual weapons to Ukraine, this was almost certainly the red line that convinced Russia of the necessity to launch a special military operation, which eventually would be launched in 2022 during the Biden administration. We have to remember that this wasn't the first time the U.S. did this. They overthrew the Georgian government in 2003. They began building it up militarily. And in 2008, according to the EU's own investigation, Georgian forces attacked Russian forces, precipitating the Georgian-Russian War of 2008, which Georgia decisively lost. So what was going on in Ukraine from 2014 all the way up until the Russian intervention in 2022 was the same process, but just on a much larger, and for Russia, a much more dangerous, unacceptable scale. They could not just allow the much larger Ukraine be pumped full of NATO weapons, NATO bases, because they would have this threat directly on their border on a much larger scale. We already saw how precarious Russia's situation was during the Russian-Georgian War in 2008. You can only imagine if Russia waited for Ukraine to be full of weapons, NATO-trained forces, before they went and attacked again. We have to remember the 2019 paper in black and white explaining how the US would really leave Russia no choice but to intervene in Ukraine or face a giant militarized regime hostile to Russia, almost certain to attack it in the near future. Now, for a lot of people, the history of this conflict in Ukraine begins in 2014 with the overthrow of the Ukrainian government by the US. For some people, it starts in 2022 when Russia intervened in Ukraine. But I would say it goes even further back than that. And I've gone over this article many, many times before. This is from all the way back in 2004. U.S. campaign behind the turmoil in Kiev. So the U.S. was trying to overthrow the Ukrainian government all the way back during the Bush administration. And it says the campaign is an American creation, a sophisticated, brilliantly conceived exercise in Western branding and mass marketing that in 4 countries in 4 years has been used to try to salvage rigged elections and topple unsavory regimes. Well, it's the U.S. interfering in the internal political affairs of other nations in violation of international law, removing governments they don't like, and installing client regimes obedient to Washington's and willing to advance U.S. foreign policy objectives, even at the cost of their own nation and their own people. And down here it says, funded and organized by the U.S. government, deploying U.S. consultancies, pollsters, diplomats, the 2 big American parties So both parties are in on it, not just the Democrats, not just the Republicans, both of them. U.S. non-government organizations, they're referring to the National Endowment for Democracy, USAID organizations like that, Freedom House even. And they admit that it was used in 2000, so this was during the Clinton administration, to overthrow the government in Serbia. They admit that it was done in Georgia, that was 2003. And they tried to do it in Belarus. They also admit that all the way in Latin America, they were doing it in Nicaragua. So this has been going on for a very, very long time. A lot of people have this misconception that U.S. foreign policy is a lot like two drivers in a car fighting over the steering wheel. And when the Republicans get the steering wheel, they drive in one direction. And when the Democrats get the steering wheel, they turn it and they go in a completely different direction, maybe even a U-turn, some people might imagine. But in reality, it is a much more accurate analogy to compare this to a single person using their left and their right legs to climb a set of stairs. So let's just look at this. I'm titling this Continuity of Agenda, the Encirclement of Russia from 1993 to 2024. And of course, we could go all the way back to the end of World War II with this, but let's just stick with 1993 to 2024. So under Bill Clinton, as per that Guardian article, they overthrew the Serbian government in 2000. This was also when NATO bombed and divided and destroyed Yugoslavia. And this was all part of encircling and containing Russia, eliminating nations that were friendly to Russia, replacing them with hostile client regimes. Under the administration of, so that was 1993 to 2001, under George Bush Jr., 2001 to 2009, the attempted overthrow of Ukraine and Belarus, the successful overthrow of Georgia in 2003, and then the 2008 Georgian attack on Russian forces. Now we have the Obama administration from 2009 to 2017. This is when they finally successfully overthrew the Ukrainian government in 2014. They installed a regime hostile to Russia, and they aided and abetted Ukraine in violating the Minsk agreements. Then you had President Donald Trump himself. He provided lethal aid to Ukraine, creating a 2003-2008 Georgia scenario. So they were recreating this. But he could not have done this if all of these other presidents before him didn't climb the stairs up to that step. And of course, after Donald Trump, we have Joe Biden, 2021 to 2024, and he is now finally presiding over this proxy war that all of these previous steps were walking up to. That was the top step, is to trigger this proxy war and hopefully overextend and collapse Russia. That is the whole point of that. And I could do a diagram exactly like this, but in relation to the Middle East, Iran, more specifically. I could also do a diagram exactly like this, depicting the continuity of agenda of U.S. foreign policy toward China. And again, that goes all the way back to World War II, actually before World War I, as a matter of fact. If a U.S. president is not in charge of U.S. foreign policy, if the people in Congress are not in charge of U.S. foreign policy, who is? Who's in charge? All you have to do is look up information about who is funding and chairing these think tanks. This is Campaign for Rand. So who's running the Rand Corporation? Who is giving money to the Rand Corporation? Now, if you look at the board of trustees, you can see it's all people going through the revolving door of corporate financier power and the U.S. government. They also work in academia, and a lot of them come from some of the largest, most powerful corporate financier interests in the collective West. Here is a list of supporters for this campaign. So if you look through all of these lists, you're going to see a lot of names. I'm just going to read you some of the ones you'd probably be most familiar with. So there's Marcia and Frank Carlucci Charitable Foundation. Well, Frank Carlucci was of the private equity firm Carlyle, the Carlyle Group. So a private equity firm, people who have shares in the largest, most powerful corporations on earth, in the collective West. There's also State Farm Insurance, Allstate Insurance Company, Alcoa Foundation. This is part of the aluminum industry. American International Group, or AIG Insurance, Dow Chemical Company, General Electric, General Motors, ExxonMobil Corporation, and Pfizer. But this is not an exhaustive list of the special interests driving U.S. foreign policy. The RAND Corporation is just one of many, many think tanks. Corporations, often the same corporations, are funding. There's an ecosystem of policy think tanks these corporations fund. And what happens is these think tanks serve as a forum to arrive at consensus between all these corporate financier interests. They write up policy papers. Policy papers are taken by lawyers and turned into bills. The bills are taken to Washington by lobbyists to be rubber stamped by Congress and signed off by whoever's in the White House, regardless of whoever's in the White House. And then the corporate media sells this policy to the American people. That is how it really works. So you cannot vote these people out of public office because they operate above public office, and everyone in public office works for them, not you or I. So how can we go about changing this? If we can't vote our way out of this at the ballot box, how do we actually change this? What do we do about this? Think about multipolarism and why multipolarism is on the rise and why the collective West's primacy over the globe is in irreversible decline. Because multipolarism is all about countries around the world creating their own alternatives to all of these corporate financier monopolies. They're creating their own payment systems, their own financial institutes, their own alternatives for all these large corporations, whether they're in industry or services. They've created these alternatives and people around the world are paying into these alternatives. That is how power is shifting. That is why there is a growing balance of power around the globe. The entire world isn't just paying into Wall Street, Washington, London, and Brussels. They're now able to spread their money, their time, their attention, and their energy across a wide variety of alternatives. And inside of America, people must do this also. They must find local alternatives, create local alternatives, pay their money, time, attention into those instead of these corporations that, again, are driving U.S. foreign policy, U.S. domestic policy, regardless of who you vote into office. So I hope that makes it clear. I hope that clears it up. The situation in Ukraine is only going to change if Russia and the rest of the multipolar world continue working to do so. Inside the United States, unless you change this formula of who holds all of the power, it's not going to change on its own. No matter who you vote into office this year, they're going to continue forward with this singular agenda that has transcended decades, multiple presidential administrations, and regardless of who is in Congress. The only reason the US is going to abandon Ukraine is just like the only reason they abandoned Afghanistan. They needed to refocus on the coming proxy war in Ukraine. And if they're going to abandon Ukraine, it's so that they can pivot toward a much larger, more dangerous war with China. And that is basically what both Trump and J.D. Vance are promising voters. Voters aren't hearing it because they only want to hear what they want to hear. They're allowing their own hope, and it's well-intentioned hope. It's well-intentioned hope. These are well-meaning people. They want to see change, but they're allowing their emotions, hope being an emotion, they're allowing that to blind them to what is really being said and what is inevitably going to happen regardless of who gets into office. So